Roll the credits. Nobody deserves any credit in this operation. How's that? Roll the 9 credits. I tell you what, if you got any money, let's roll the guy that wrote the credit. Oh, hello. Rather than start all over again, why don't we just drag out some of what we've been talking about already? Well, if for nothing else, just think it'll save you the effort of me saying, well, let's talk about something completely different, and everybody have to go, ah! So, let's just keep on dragging it out. All right, how about this? It's not all that bad because, truthfully, if anybody's interested, there were a few things that I had to say in addition to some of the stuff I'd already brought up, since I'm the one who brought it up anyway. I'll cut it off sometime. But I was going to point out a few other things. Remember my little diagram? As anatomically and spatially lacking as it is, of the city and all the institutions, and that without any doubt, if you just pass for being relatively sane, you are going to be raised in the city. And you will be raised on the basis of finding yourself very quickly, at an early age, standing, probably with your family, standing on top of, in the widest sense of the word, the roofs of certain institutions or / cultural structures, everything from religion to love of family and blah, 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 occupation, etc. A little more extensive in this consideration was this. Is in the city, all ordinary people, things are just as they should be, but from a view, if you were outside the city, I suggest. Perhaps not the only view, to say the least, but if you consider this even three-dimensionally a little more correct, and the city was sitting down in the bottom of a cauldron, of a wok, and it was surrounded by hillsides. From certain places on that hillside, outside the city, if you could get there, I would be suggesting this, that even though it is correct and the city is operating quite efficiently, that down in the city, standing on your institutions, you have people thinking as little as possible. It's not their choice, and there's nothing wrong, but the more they are down in the city running on regular, non-turbocharged, not thinking any more than they have to, that is, not transforming, not transmitting any more energy than is necessary. The more they do that, the more they are tied to, the more they are dependent upon the institutions and the structures upon which they stand. This results in, not an attack on these people, and I'll just try to make up a new little term so it does not sound to you newer people out there on tape perhaps as being some form of social criticism, because it's not. But it results in a kind of strength through density. A kind of strength through crudeness. A kind of strength through one-wayism, dullness, laziness. Now specifically, what I mean behind all that is, and this could be it, it's not dependent upon how educated someone is in the city. It could be someone uneducated, but it could be someone quite well trained academically in other areas. They may hold political power, religious power. But the more they are operating at the normal city level, that is, they do not in any way think more than they have to. The more they are tied to, the more they are dependent upon literally that which is under their real and psychological, metaphorical feet, their institutions. What it results in is what seems to be a whole manner of things. Patriotism, nationalism, love of race, love of country, love of your homeland, love of your old neighborhood, love of your family, love of your nationality. Now, that, of course, is not an attack on any of those things because they are absolutely necessary in the city. There's no more attack on that than it was an attack on saying, when I point out that people in the city, if they're operating simply at the basis of running on regular, of just firing up here just as much as they have to putter along in life. And they may be puttering along as the head of an academic institution, or they may be puttering along on the basis of repairing small electrical appliances. But the point is, they do not think any more than they have to. The nervous system itself does not operate any more than it has to. I say think, but for those of you that want to consider it right quick from a lower basis, on the basis that most people do not care to move about any more than they have to. Most people do not care to exercise what would appear to be so-called human emotions any more than they have to. If something is said or if somebody operates in such a way, and you automatically, if you're an ordinary person, if you automatically went, boy, I hate people like that. And if life was wired in such a way that somebody came out of the bushes and says, you shouldn't say you hate people. You used to claim to be a real Christian or a Jew or Muslim. You shouldn't do that. And you might go, yeah, you're right. But your idea, yeah, you're right, but the hell with it. I got no interest. I got no motivation. I'm not irritated enough. I'm not going to think about it. I don't like it. Well, you shouldn't say that. Okay, I won't. There was still no more thought about it. You might say, boy, I hate that stuff. And the guy that you're talking about might say, are you talking to me? And suddenly you realize the son of a bitch is about twice your size. You say, oh, no, talking about somebody else. It's not that you thought anymore. It's not that you considered the occurrence in some expanded fashion. So by all that, and I'm just saying think more, because that is at the possible open end of the human nervous system where someone might be able to actually expand their operations in a way that would have an impact on the whole organism, because just getting more exercise will not have that kind of dramatic effect on the human nervous system. So that's why I'm using the example right now to say, in the city, those who think just at the bare minimum, just as much as you have to, just enough to keep going, which is 99 point something or other, I won't tell you exactly, but of everybody on this planet. The more they are tied to that, the more they are tied to what seems to be an absolute dependence upon all those ordinary institutions and cultural structures. And by now, all of you should have some smell of this. It's necessary in the city, and within certain boundaries, there's no great danger, but all of you by now should have some sort of smell when somebody stands up and says, by God, I've had enough. I want to say a good word about Arkansas. By God, I grew up in Arkansas. My family's from Arkansas, and I'm going to tell you some of the finest people on this planet. They don't make people like they do in Arkansas. Now, this is not sarcasm. It's not a joke. All of you have heard that. Chances are all of you have done some form of that in the past. But if you look at it, if you think a little more than you have to, you realize that this, in a sense, at the very least, is meaningless, because people in Arkansas is simply a place where they drew lines around the Mississippi River and around the Arkansas River and whatever the other boundaries are, the Red River or whatever, and they call it Arkansas. So in a sense, there is no such thing as somebody from Arkansas. There are people, but there's no such thing as the Arkansas person any more than there is, as I was pointing out. There is no Harvard outside the people who go to Harvard. There are no institutions. There is no church. The buildings are not the church. The boundaries, the place on a map, the boundaries out there on the highways that say you are now entering Arkansas. You don't suddenly cross from Oklahoma to Arkansas and go, wow, whew, at least now we got some decent people. Arkansasians, or whatever the hell they're called. That, boy, give me a break, get those people from Oklahoma away from me. You know that's not true, and yet nobody questions it if somebody says, I love Arkansas, I'd die for Arkansas. Now, in some circles in the city, that is even looked at as being admirable, for somebody to have that kind of love. But do you understand, do you smell it all? The more a person is expressing that, the more of those kinds of energy they pass out. And it does not have to just be a state. It could be a whole nation. But I was thinking it down to the level that many people, it almost gets down to fighting words if you say a bad word about somebody's home state or maybe even their home city. That all my folks are from here. For you people up north, that means your relatives. People, blood kin. Somebody say, my folks are from South Carolina or from South Dakota. I grew up here, now I've left. I had to go off to the war, and I flew around New York for a while. But by God, that's still where I consider I'm from. I can still feel my roots back there. My family's there. My dear sainted mother and all my kin, all my folks, they're from there. And there's nobody like people from wherever. If you, I'm saying from the lowest end, that is of no great consequence, but all of you should be able to smell when it gets a little further. The more someone is tied to that, the closer you get into areas of fanaticism. And I do not mean just fanaticism over, I would die for Arkansas. It can then come out in some other area. It could come out in a political area. Does anybody follow? The more you find an Attila or a Hitler or a Stalin, the more you're going to find somebody. You should know this. They'll about be ready to punch you in the nose if you say a bad word about Bavaria or Georgia, the one in Russia. All of the things that would appear to be within certain limits, that would appear to be admirable. Now, let's back up for a second from the extreme of being a fanatic about anything. Just people who seem to be proud of their heritage. Reasonably, right down sort of the middle of the road. Proud of their religion. Proud of their race. Proud of where they came from. Proud of if there was some other way they could drag it in, that all my family have been doctors. All the way back to my great-great-grandfather. And I don't know, it just seemed like medicine is in our genes. So it can be that far that somebody could believe, could think, that there are several institutions upon which they're standing. The more that they are tied to, the more that they will express that I have real love, real pride, almost to the point that I do not like to hear somebody talk to me, make jokes. I guess so. I hate to be a fanatic, but I don't really like to hear jokes about medicine and doctors. And I don't really like to hear jokes, to tell you the truth, about Arkansas. And especially, well, to tell you the truth, also about the Methodist religion. The more someone is like that, do you understand, the closer they're getting into an area, getting from the fairly innocuous part, from an outside view, into an area that begins to get rather pressing. Gets to be rather depressing. It gets to be what I was inferring to start with, a kind of strength by crudeness, by density. Because if you carry this far enough, you get into what is the area of real fanaticism in the city, and is the kind of, I guess it would ordinarily be called, charismatic attraction of a fanatic, that the fanatic in some way, whether it be political, economic, religious, the fanatic is someone who says, this is the truth about one thing, and anybody that says it's not, we know what to do with them. It is not open to debate. It is not open to any sort of joking. It's not open to a discussion. To be a Methodist from Arkansas means to rule the world. I just made that up. But to start some big campaign that we're going to start. The first great kingdom of Arkansasian Methodists. It is that kind of attraction. It has a kind of quite correct molecular, biological attraction, as you should know throughout history. Not all the time, but when circumstances are just right, whatever life's doing, which we're not going into right now, a fanatic has an attraction. The fanaticism, though, is always, in a sense, to make this equation, if you could see it outside the city, it is an equation wherein they are thinking less and less. Now remember, this is not any ordinary thing to say, well, a Stalin is an idiot. In some senses, the Stalins of the world, and the Attilas, and the Genghis Khans, in a sense, they're a lot smarter than anybody they conquered. You've got to remember that. They're not idiots. There's nothing impressive about them either. But it's not a matter of education. It's not a matter of intellectual malfunctioning. It is a matter that's operating only at minimal level, and it operates in a very specific area. It's where all their attention, where all their energy is driven, and it is reflected in love, in expressed love, dependence, ties to the institutions. It is almost, if I made it an equation, that the lack of potential, much less execution of actual thinking, trying to think more than you have to in life, you would subtract that side of the equation into the other side of some love of institution, religion, nationality, something, family. You add the same amount to the other side of the equation. If you wanted to look, if you were up in the hillside somewhere looking at this, you might come up with your own description that if you saw it, you might. How about we call it the dread of the certains? The dread of the city certains. And in a quite similar way, something else that we were talking about last time we were taping, that in city affairs, if you recall, I was pointing out how people are led normally to try and separate. It just happens in conversation. It happens in the way in which the intellect works, of separating institutions, cultural structures, from the people. That is, of believing, of people saying, well, the example I ripped out last time was in the news that day, last time we were taping, about the present government of the United Republics of Socialist Soviet Republics, admitting that some of the particular atrocity, war atrocity as it was, as they called it, they now admitted that the people that they had formerly blamed, in this case the Germans, were not actually responsible. It was a sad result of Stalinism. And I use the example that is an institutional reference, that is a cultural structure, Stalinism. We know what they mean by that. It goes quite well in history down the city. It means just as much as it should mean, no more, no less. Went right along. But you do understand there is no such thing as Stalinism any more than there is anything as the Catholic Church. The institution does not exist. The cultural structure, whether it be apparently a positive or a pejorative reference there too, there is no such thing as those structures. They're only the people involved. So there's no such thing as Stalinism. There were some people who went out there and shot all those soldiers or whatever the atrocity was that they're now trying to sort of admit to. Of course, it wasn't us, not us admitting it. Because one thing, that's one of the good stories and the first stories in life, when it gets to reach a certain level, one guy can finally admit to a murder. But one man does not admit, or one small cadre of men do not admit to widespread atrocities. They will admit that somebody else close to them did it. My superiors, some guys down the hall, some people did it when we were out to lunch. But part of the first story is they still do not point an exact finger. One small variation of that is if somebody is dead, sometimes you can point down to a grave. But they do not point at the live people, you point at institutions. And I'm getting around to more of this for you people, maybe on tape, that think that this is still some social commentary, which it is not. Or whether you think it has anything to do with politics, it does not. What I wanted you to consider a little bit further, it goes on all the time. I surely don't have to go into many more examples. It happens in everyday conversation. You do it, and it does not have to be on the basis as widespread as what would seem to be some historical event, such as war crimes, or it happens in everyday conversation that people make reference to institutions instead of people when there are no such things. But the little bit I want you to try and consider a bit further, as men are led to make these kind of spurious separations between institutions and people, and part of it is on the basis, part of the purpose on the basis, it's like a first story exemption. It is like a first story forgiveness. Let me try one more time for you people on tape. This has got nothing to do with laying blame for anything, because the examples I'm using are of no interest to this kind of activity. The examples are just there. If it wasn't that, I'd be using the NCAA playoffs. I'd be using the last Super Bowl. I'd be using something. But being driven, the energy is going through intellectual man, reasonable, civilized man, to continually, in an unrecognized manner, to separate institutions and to speak of them, to speak of these verbal constructs as though they actually existed apart from people. And without people going to Harvard, there is no such thing as Harvard. I know there are buildings up there, and I know that they have property, and I know they have an endowment, but there is no such thing as a Harvard. If everybody connected with Harvard disappears, and goes to live with Rod Serling or Elvis and just gone, there is no such thing as Harvard. If all the people who belong to the Catholic Church go poof, suddenly, there is no such thing as the Catholic Church. They got all that property, they got their own bank accounts, but there is no longer a Catholic Church. Now, in more subtle ways, this separation, this dealing verbally with people as though they could be separated from the institutions on which they stand. And remember, it's not just churches, it's not just colleges. You're standing up on the basis of your neighborhood, maybe just your family. Us Joneses here in South Carolina have always amounted to something. At least we're better than those Smiths down the road. A part of this separation serves the purpose of a kind of first story forgiveness. And it goes something like this. Kinds of headlines you've been surrounded by all your life, and whether you know it or not, your great grand progenitors over in Greece and Italy and Germany had their own versions of this, their own little headlines that they were just written in those funny things that I'm going to try to translate. But it says such things as, poverty, the ultimate cause of criminal behavior, of crime. And in fact, many times, just to fit in with what I'm talking about, they'll refer to it oftentimes as institutionalized poverty. Or they'll describe other aspects of institutionalized discrimination, perhaps religiously, that they'll use it, it's been going on now for a handful of years in Northern Ireland, to say that there is a kind of institutionalized discrimination against Catholics to such a degree. Well, it comes out in headlines like this. Let's go from poverty. I'll give you several examples. The headline could read something like this: perception of political impotence feeds civil unrest. Now that one is nothing new. You don't have to look at Northern Ireland or Lebanon. Some of the Greeks were going around nodding their head about that, especially because of having to chisel those headlines on big old pieces of stone that took so. But you hear this, it's just a continuing story. Perception of political impotence fuels civil unrest. That everywhere on this planet, in every city, consider the city represents any so-called political province that you come up with, a city, a state, a nation, a whole epoch of history, that in there, people are dancing forward, some are dancing backwards. Some have got a lot of money, a lot of kopecks, a lot of ruples. A lot of people have got very little. A lot of people are big and fat and tall and healthy and ruddy-cheeked. A lot of them are not. A lot of people are up, a lot of people are down. The perceived political impotence feeds civil unrest. Or another one. Let me see if I can give at least 3 examples. Economic frustrations fuel drug crisis. All right, now take all of these. And one more time, you people don't say this is not laying blame. It's got nothing to do with poverty. It's got nothing to do with poor people, people taking drugs. It's got nothing to do with any of that, believe it or not. But here we go. Life gives me the examples. I mean, what goes on in the city? Just reporting the news. You do understand, once I put it to you this way, there is no such thing as, quote, poverty. There are poor people, but there is no such thing as poverty. Perceived political impotence. We all know what that means. People that do not have the vote in a place that even passes for being a so-called democratic state or city. People who believe that I have no political power. So, the beginning of that headline, it reads like a noun, or a clause that would be a noun. Perceived political impotence. That is what causes the civil unrest, these murders, these atrocities between the Protestants and the Catholics in Northern Ireland, between the Protestants and themselves, between the Muslims, between the Jews down in Lebanon. It's the feeling over here in these camps, in these little enclaves. It's the perception of political impotency. We all know what that means. It flies in the city. It means something. I'm sure on the McLaughlin Report or William F. Buckley, they'll be discussing. I'm sure they have discussed such things as our topic today is the perception of political impotency and its dreadful aftermath throughout history. I guess maybe Buckley or somebody tried to be a little broader in scope than just I could be wrong. But they're discussing throughout history. Let us say that they are trying to be wider in their discussion. That throughout history, the civil unrest, the Greek states in Rome, I could stand here just as fast as I could talk, and I'm being a historian, and I could make something that sound like a reasonable argument, that it was not just the external attacks of the Visigoths and the Oligoths and Fred Flintstone and Attila that actually brought down the Roman Empire. No. It was the inequalities internally. I know by some historians they tried. But my God, they had economic, they had political, they had social inequalities that rival any today. They actually had legal slavery. We all know all about that. So we can say that internally you had large numbers of people living quite well, thank you. Wrapped in sheets, monogrammed, hanging around the baths, living quite well. And then you had these other people, large numbers throughout the empire, not just there in Italy, but strung out in the empire, that what was their main feeling every day? It was a feeling that grew, at least it was their perception, of political impotency. And all the people discussing the matters, people with PhDs, or at least a good 8th grade education, going, yes, that there's no doubt historically this has had great ramifications in history. But wait a minute, there is no such thing as political impotency. There is really no such thing, if you want to make it real good, to go ahead and maybe re-quote my own headline, there is certainly no such thing as perceived political impotency. But don't let that through. There is actually no such thing as political impotency. Now you can say, well, wait a minute, there is, because I know what it means. If we had a person over here, or a whole group of people, say all the people that in the Roman Empire, all the people that they captured when they ran into what is now Syria, into that area of the Middle East, everybody they captured, they said for whatever reason they want, you people will never vote. You might as well forget it. We'll treat you fairly decent, but you're never going to vote. And so there it was. There is a matter historically of political impotency. No. Now you're pointing in an example. You're saying these people were politically impotent. But do you see that continually the intellect passes information in such a way that they discuss political impotency or poverty as though that existed? This is no different than some of you that thought you had it before, that you do realize the church, the Catholic Church, the Methodist Church, any church does not exist. There is no such thing. There's Catholics. There are students of Harvard, but there is no such thing as Harvard. There is no such thing as the Presbyterian Church. There are Presbyterians. There is no such thing as the Christian Democratic Party in Germany. There's no such thing as that party. There are people who make up the party. But do you realize, may I warn one more time, it's no discussion of city blame or exemptions, but do you see that the way in which it does operate, that it gives a kind of first story exemption and forgiveness, that if you say, well, wait a minute, we have these people over here who are threatening to overthrow the government, out there throwing the cocktails, the Molotov, not the neat kind they serve at the Carlisle Hotel. They're out there doing this, putting up barricades, attempting to storm the citadels. But when you consider that poverty, the frustrations of political inequality are the basis of it, ... or comma, then what are you saying? To say that, for instance, to get it back if that's getting too obscure, poverty causes crime. They found that scratched on the latrines under Pompeii when they dug it out. Well, it's almost past the point. Anyway, you should know. Poverty causes crime. No. To use their terminology, criminals cause crime. Poverty doesn't cause anything. If you say, well, poverty caused crime. Last night, a person held up a 7-Eleven store here and shot somebody, and we found out they were underemployed. Poverty causes crime. You do not find bankers out holding up 7-Eleven stores. You do not find the statistics, I'm sure, that will support this, that you do not find people making in excess of, let's say, $27,500 a year has ever held up a 7-Eleven store. Not unless they were under the influence of some obscure drug. So it is obvious poverty causes crime. And here's an example. You say, well, wait a minute. Or if you were thinking in a certain way. Not that this is wrong in the city, but if you're going to try to follow what I'm showing you, that the energy runs in a certain way that comes out as a kind of exemption, a kind of forgiveness, and it serves its own purpose, though. Poverty didn't cause this guy laying there who's now dead in the robbery of the 7-Eleven store. Whoever did it caused it, in the sense of the city. We're not talking about ultimate causes and all that. We're talking about just in the city, just the way the ordinary intellect works. Poverty did not cause this guy's demise laying there in a pool of blood and the cash register cleaned out. Whoever did it caused it. But notice, it is still as true as that in the city. Like getting, even if I was talking to somebody at the ordinary city level intelligence, even if I said, look, I don't get in a great sociological discussion, I'm trying to get you to see something verbally going on. They might say, well, you know, I know what you're saying. But that still does not belie the fact that the guy that did this, he didn't just come in and do that. It's a bigger story than that. It's actually, if we don't want to be that crude and direct that poverty causes crime, how about unequal social conditions? Or how about just social conditions? Or how about just conditions? Conditions cause crime. Or let's be real specific. Conditions cause murder. Okay. Is that true? Have you ever seen conditions in a cell? Have you ever seen, even on a TV show, as weird as they can get, the police jump out and grab conditions and slap it around and throw it against the wall, say, put your hands up. Take the position. Now, you've been around the block, and then later you see conditions being brought before a grand jury, tried. A person. And yet, it is true. In the city, it is operational. It serves a purpose to say. Maybe I took it far enough that some of you are beginning to peek into it, because I know the words are loaded of poverty and all that. I understand that completely. But all it amounts to is saying conditions, environment. Environment causes, and then you can fill in the blank. Civil unrest, nervous breakdown, stress, drug use, the drug crisis, and conditions do not cause the drug crisis. People taking drugs, I'm just using their term. They call it a drug crisis. Do you understand? If you had nobody taking drugs and you had the same conditions that they say, all right, the conditions here in this city, especially over in this part of the city, the conditions are what causes the drug crisis. All right, if I went, all right, and nobody was taking drugs, you do understand there'd be no drug crisis. I mean, it couldn't be simpler. So where is it that they say, wait, conditions? Conditions cause crime. If this seems too negative, how about this? Conditions cause PhDs. No. Conditions don't. Well, you can say, well, it certainly does. You've got to have the right kind of home environment. You need a family that encourages you to read at an earliest possible age, encourages you to do studies on your own rather than watch TV all the time when you're a little nipper, encourages you to excel in school, encourages you to take care of your health, then helps pay your way through school. Those kind of conditions are what produces the intellectuals, the leaders. It's the conditions that produce the leaders, the educated people. No, it's not. It's people that go to school, to use their terms, and get educated are what produces educated people. It's the same thing as saying conditions causes the death and the robbery of the man here at the 7-Eleven store. No, the conditions didn't. Somebody did. But notice, it is a kind of blanket settle, and I'm using forgiveness in no moral sense, and there's no attack on it. I'm using forgiveness to try and slip you up to see something. It is a way in which energy seeps and is able to run in a lateral manner, and it's like it's why I call it a first story forgiveness. It seems like, if you're just ordinarily educated, sophisticated person in the city and you hear the term poverty or conditions, social conditions cause crime. It just goes through. It's like, yeah. It allows energy to go in a way that if it came straight forward right now, the energy would not move. That is, the kinds of ways I'm putting it, if you took this out in the street to ordinary people, and you tried to present this, they'd say, wait a minute, this sounds like some kind of devices maybe that's about to spring off into some kind of right-wing demagoguery, or you're attacking those who are attacking social inequalities. Because they got nothing else to make of it. You could not take this energy, if life was doing it now, and suddenly, on some large scale, a group of people stood up and said, wait a minute, conditions do not cause crime, people cause crime. Conditions do not cause the so-called drug crisis, people taking drugs. Conditions do not cause people to be educated. People getting educated cause people to be educated. If this sort of thing was presented and in some way it had some effect, which it will not and it cannot and should not, it would stop a certain kind of lateral flow of energy that in a sense is getting into backdoor areas that people are not wired up to specifically look at. Got nothing to do with social condition, got nothing to do with moral strength, character of people. It has to do with the way in which life is growing and the way in which energy is moved around. It always comes back, if any of you think you're really getting confused, and I'll try and simplify it or make it worse, it always comes back to people being involved with this question, whether they know it or not, or ever say it this way or not, do I have free will or not? That's what it gets down to, whether anybody ever uses the term or not. That is, am I responsible for what I just did? And the audience goes, I like that. And you think, you forget that you were even. And somebody says, my God, why'd you do that? And you go, oh, the conditions. The conditions. And withal, you look at other people, and am I benefiting from what this person just did? Do I enjoy it? Does it entertain me? Does it profit me? Yes or no, you end up as to whether, why did you do that? And then the other person, perhaps, the energy that they're transforming and transmitting may go, wait a minute, conditions. Yeah. You go, hey, screw conditions. Don't tell me that. You had you got free will. You didn't have to do that. You see what it caused me. You see the expense I went to. You didn't have to do that. Or conversely, if it was more agreeable and profitable to you, and you say, hey, I appreciate that. The person says, it's my privilege. I've always liked you. I'm glad to have done that. Then under ordinary conditions, you do not go, wait a minute, why should I thank him? He's just a helpless tool of the great machinery of life. He was nice to me because he had to be. People do not operate that way, see? Because they're already wired up, not using the words, to be dealing constantly. It is like a digital, and I don't mean it strictly mechanically, of course, because humans are not machines, but it's like a digital running of the energy is according to where you feel as though I am being primed for profit, or I'm about to be plucked. As to whether you feel as though you and whoever you're dealing with and dancing with in this situation, whether there is a matter of free will going on. Because if somebody's nice to you, you accepted that they had free will. They did it. They did it because they recognize what a great guy you are. But then if it's something that is not going to profit you and you point the finger of accusation, then other people, by and large, are inclined to go, hey, poverty, social inequality. In other words, conditions. What they're saying is, wait a minute, I couldn't help it. And then you do the same thing. It is like this constant digital running as to whether I'm on or off. Whether I'm thinking in such a way that, yeah, free will, conditions. All right, does somebody see a little clearer? As long as you are tied to and dependent upon your feeling of the institutions, that your main feeling of you, and if you're an ordinary person, there's nothing wrong with this. If any ordinary people, by some strange accident watching this tape, it's just entertainment. Just remember that. It's just showbiz. I'm just a comic trying to build my way up. I know you hadn't heard of me. And material is real scarce nowadays. Or maybe not scarce, I just can't afford better writers, all right? So don't take it seriously. The rest of you, if you're not ordinary, the less you have any inclination, any need to think more than you have to, the more the kinds of things that everyone else says is important, like love of race, love of family, love of religion, love of my homeland, love of my political party, love of my father's political party. The more you're stuck with that, that is the basis of your life. Nothing wrong with it. All in favor of it. I'm not here to wreck that boat. If I did, all these buildings around us would begin to tumble and you'd get dust and stuff all over you. There'd be more people running in the streets than there are now. But in the midst of all this, it is like a safety valve. It is like a way for energy to still seep out in directions that are not specifically identifiable, and it comes about through the intellect using these verbal structures, which is what they all are. We call them institutions, we're calling them cultural structures. They are verbal structures to refer to things like conditions. Social conditions cause crime. That is as hip and up to date now as it was 5,000 years ago. All right, 2,500 years ago. It is just as meaningful. It is just as sophisticated. It is just as humane. It is right at the avant-garde of social commentary to say that. But notice in one quite real sense, verbally, that sentence is as hollow as last week's Christmas or Passover or Ramadan chocolate Easter bunny. Don't any Muslims write me. I don't know what you give each other for Ramadan except a headache. Don't write me about that. Because, see, it's going without food all day give you a headache. So people are so touchy. Which I don't mind except when they're touchy and armed. And then, do you understand that life works in such a way that it's not psychological? That's not the end of the sentence. But if we looked at it right quick psychologically, if you need any other twist of view, it is like an open end. It is like a psychological way out that you do not have to accuse people specifically about, boy, you're a criminal. Or, boy, you're socially a misfit. Instead of pointing to people, you point where? To the verbal constructions. That is, to the institutions. Oh, I know he shot the guy, they say, and killed him, for $12. But no. It's still, I know it may sound like an old liberal cliche, but it's poverty actually causes crime. Yeah. He pulled the trigger. It's conditions that cause people to be educated. Yeah, but it's this guy that went to school for 12 years, graduated from Harvard Med School to become an orthopedic surgeon. Don't any of you fishermen write me. Much less you orthopedics. It is a kind of release. It is a kind of blanket forgiveness to continually make these references. And if any of you can get a little better at this, I guess I better change the paragraph apparently. You're doing this internally. You're continually blaming and or excusing yourself on the basis of conditions. You're not necessarily using the terms of yourself about, well, of course I can think of some that you could. You could think, well, boy, I feel guilty buying Penthouse again. I guess it's my Catholic upbringing. It's not your Catholic upbringing. Now, it's true enough. You say, well, yeah, it is. That's the only reason I feel guilty. I feel guilty about sex, period. And I know it's my puritanical background. You're saying, well, there's a guy laying here dead, and I got the money out of the cash register in my pocket and this gun in my hand. But wait a minute. Social conditions cause this, not me. Internally, you may, I went ahead and gave you a hard-wired example if you were following, that somebody might be saying to themselves, I would not have this kind of sketchy attitude, this guilty attitude towards sex were it not for my blah, blah, blah conditions. But then they're constantly going on inside the operations of one's intellect, less specific attempts to blame and to forgive, but on the basis not that it's me, because now you're outside the idea of any free will, but it's on the basis that institutionally there's something somewhere, and it doesn't have to be named. All I know is it's not me. Now, I guess you could say that you think I actually did this thing right here, but it is the institutional constructions within your own intellect. Because all these little buildings are not just down in the city proper, they're also in here. If they weren't in here, people wouldn't build them down there. you end up standing on. You're limited to, you're tied to your whole feeling not only of being alive, which is pretty psychological, but your whole ability to think is tied to, yes, I'm from Indiana, darn proud of it, a Hoosier through and through, and a good Mormon. You want to make something out of it? I mean, that's what life's about, isn't it? Eating some corn, dancing the polka. And if you don't like it, you don't like it. That side of the equation, the more you feel that, if you're an ordinary person, the more you say that you feel that, the less there is any chance that you're going to pursue the kind of entertaining method I made up one time, if you recall, of trying to think more than you have to. What's there to think about? You don't have to think to eat corn. You don't have to think to be a Mormon. You don't have to think to dance the polka. You don't have to think to be from Indiana. Come to think about it, you don't have to think to be alive, do you? Well, no more than I am now. That's it. And one reason that you are not required to think any more than you do now is the institutions funnel the energy for you. Hey, I don't have to think. I graduated from Harvard. I don't have to think. I'm a Presbyterian. I don't have to think. I'm British. There it is. I don't have to think. I'm an attorney. I don't have to think. I don't guess you know it. I'm one of the Jones boys. That's what all of it is. Some halfway side ones. Can you see also, if you saw any of that? That's all I might point out. Real parenthetical before I got semi-parenthetical. That good Kairoot tonight. Did anybody see any connection? That you could call it the city code, or one of the city codes, is always blame the non-present. And if they're not available, blame the non-existent. Conditions! Yeah. And I'm talking, when I say conditions, I'm talking about conditions. All right, back to just a semi-parenthetical. If you can see that there is already wired up into man that which leads the intelligence down the city to unthinkingly, unknowingly, and with all proper consequences, all proper purposes being served in the city, but they are continually separating in a spurious way, if you see it from another view, separating institutions from those who actually make them up. Can you also, a little bit further, can you also see that there is the continuing, if not spurious, how about this time, specious attempt men are led to do to separate individual people, a person, from his functions? We've already talked about it. It would just seem to be on a wider scale. Well, yes, I seem to have this gun in my hand, and there does seem to be a man here dying, and I do seem to have the money from the cash register in my pocket. But things are not necessarily as straightforward as they appear. And a cop, or perhaps someone there in the store, says, wait a minute. I'll just bet you, before they take you away, I'll just bet you. I bet you are not a college graduate. No. I bet you are not a professional person. No. I'll bet you, I don't know where I heard this figure, but I bet you didn't make anything over 25, 27,000 last year, did you? No. Do you hear? It's an attempt to separate an individual from the functions. All right, again, I refer you back to the continuing struggle with the most likely unverbalized question of, do I have free will or not? Can I use this right now in this situation? Does the other person have free will or not? How will it best explain to my advantage my actions, their actions, the way I feel about their actions, the way they seem to feel about my actions? I almost hesitate, but here goes. How about even a little more subtle? Also in the city, Things are wired up in such a way throughout humanity that there is the continuing separation of thoughts, ideas, whole belief systems from those who thought them. I'll just go ahead and announce, since I know, or I suspect that some of this has seemed somewhat obscure tonight. But wait a minute, it's not my fault. You don't know the conditions under which I grew. You don't know the conditions under which I learned all this. God, I'd like to hear that. But anyway, let's skip obscurity for 1 second. How about another possible law? All right, just a good old statement. You don't have to make this a law. But it is this, that there is no such creature as a thought. That's not self-evident. There is no such thing as a thought without somebody who thought it, without somebody who was a conductor for the energy that comes out. And ordinary people down in the city say, well, what a great thought, what a great idea. But then they treat it, the idea of democracy. There is no such thing. Well, don't give me that crap. I can tell you exactly what it is. It is a political system, a state, a city somewhere, wherein the political power is in the hands of the people as opposed to some tyrannical, some form of royalty, some ancestral passing along of power. So there is an idea. People die for it. Don't stand and tell me there's no such thing as the democratic idea, or the idea of democracy. My father, God bless him, was from Ohio. Lost his little finger in World War I. Let's don't go into how. But gave up his little finger for the idea of democracy. There is no such thing as the idea of democracy without somebody to think it. We are running out of time, which is probably a good thing tonight. There's a reason for me bringing this up. A very practical reason, having to do with the operations of your own nervous system, if indeed you're interested in this kind of stuff beyond the point of ordinary thinking about it, which is, of course, running, what is it nowadays, 87 octane. You believe that there's information. You believe that there are ideas, especially when it gets into belief systems. So we get democracy. How about the secret information? That there is some DNA code that perhaps came from another part of the universe. I'm trying to update the old ideas of mysticism and all that flim-flam. That there's a secret book somewhere with information. That I know I can feel it burning in my heart. That I don't know what's going on. Sometimes I think this kind of activity is close. But I want to, I'm tired of all this running around, beating around the bushes. I want to know what the secret is. And I know it's somewhere. Where? Well, maybe it used to, they said it was in Tibet when I was growing up. Maybe they moved it. But it's somewhere, right? It's in a book. There is no such thing as an idea. There's not such a creature. Of course, there's energy. But there is no such thing as an idea, much less whole belief systems. Whole belief, religious, philosophical, mystical, political, economic. There is no such thing as even one thought. Let me point it out. Oh, I know. It lives over in the same neighborhood with poverty and conditions. Yeah, I know. They're hiding out. There is no such animal as a thought, separate from someone who thought it. And just because they thought it and then said it, and you say, well, now it's in some public domain. Now the thing has a life of its own. In fact, I was about to quote for humanity one of those things about you can kill a man, but you cannot kill his ideas. But notice, throughout history, down in the city, they'll settle for killing the man. It operates very well. It's later some people say, well, you killed the man, but you didn't kill the idea because we still remember the idea. And the king says, what? and the person that said, I didn't say anything. Because they suddenly realized, well, even if that kind of crap's true, that you can kill a man, but you can't kill the idea, I shouldn't have said that because I'd probably be next in line. And I just don't want to be part of this axiom. Now back internally, all of this has, the reason I was suggesting to you, some real pertinence, is that you believe that ideas exist in you in some way floating around like free electrons, or even in a more mystical or more spiritual or more cerebral way that they're ideas that perhaps you think that are just kind of floating, that you picked up, that you heard from somebody, you read in a book, and you sort of try to let them float, and you try to skywrite them up there around the clouds in your own brain, and you go back and you look at it, you ponder it, you wonder whether, is this idea absolutely correct, or is this idea sort of metaphorical that's pointing me somewhere? What idea? You don't have an idea. You can have an idea, but you do not have an idea. Nobody does. Well, yeah, I do. I read this idea right here. It said, things are not as bad as they seem. Up is up and down is down, and never the twain shall meet, except in Horace Greeley's backyard. God is love. That's an idea. There is no such thing as an idea. Well, there is. I just said it. That's an idea. It is not an idea until somebody thinks it. Well, all right, I'm thinking it. But it is treated. Things are wired up in such a way that the human intellect, not only on the wide scale, socially, politically, and every other way in the city, but individually inside the privacy of your own skull, without any analyzation, you take ideas as actually being something. Well, it's like a cupcake I ate. It's like a piece of little cotton I stuck in my ear. It's something I got. Here's an idea. Don't laugh at it. I'm talking about this is a serious idea. I guess somebody ordinary could say, well, I saw some of your tapes, and one of the great ideas I got from you. Yeah, where is it? Well, I can still repeat it. I wrote it down. That's not an idea. It is not separate from somebody thinking it. There is no such creature. Unless, of course, it is hiding out with Elvis and conditions and poverty. The practical possibilities are not negative, of course. None of these are, no matter how they sound to some of you novices. Wait a minute, there are no such things as... We ain't got time for that. It is a kind of fool's errand, it is a kind of unprofitable for a revolutionist use of energy through the intellect to continue, without you understanding it, to treat ideas as though they existed, apart from somebody thinking it. Not forget any sort of social dance or any kind of intercourse between you and me, or you and a book, or you and somebody dead, you and some whole belief system, you and you. You and the chemical, electrical firings of your own brain, you sit right there. Everyone does, and you take ideas as being something that's up here. You got no choice ordinarily. I read this in a book. This idea just knocked me down when I read that. Now I've been thinking about it. I'm not saying I understand it completely, but this idea is something. What idea? And you treat it as though it is a something that you now have. You're standing on an institution. In this case, the institution is believing that functions of people, individually and collectively, in some way can be separated from the people. It will not be dissected and lived. It will not even be investigated from an external, from an outside the city, from an extra city view, and survive. It is why ordinary men can't know themselves, and why it's such a lingering, beautiful, and attractive and captious idea about the greatest thing is to know thyself. And many people swoon. The reason they swoon is, if you try to know yourself, you've killed the frog. You can't investigate it without killing it, because you are doing exactly what I've been talking about tonight. You are separating a man from the function. And that cannot be done under city conditions, any more than somebody in the city. If you say, wait a minute, our religion is a waste of time, and you've got these people standing over there on top of a temple or a synagogue or a church, and they go, all right, I'll take your word for it. I've always suspected it. What are they going to do? They got one choice. Jump up and never come back down. That is the same thing as attempting to study it, and you kill it through the investigation. And yet that is going on continually, the separation of an institution from the people that make it up, the separation of an individual from his functions, the separation that ideas, beliefs, thoughts exist apart from somebody to think them. Aren't you glad we're completely out of tape so that I can say, really, this has some real practical use? Whew. Bye.